My question to you is, as what I've limitedly understood about the 1989 revolutions, was looking at whether or not the ideology behind the 1989 revolution, specifically the political philosophies that were used to articulate the changes necessary that would be required of a future society. And so was there any ideological foundation as to trying to reform the system? And if so, what was it? Or is it rather like, as I like to coin, anarcho-liberalism, where you had individuals, each individual come up with their own ideology, and they served in a process of trying to individually describe to themselves, almost in a reactionary sense?
I'll say something briefly. Of course, I like practically everything that Jan said. As he said, he liked practically everything that I said. But he didn't come out and say what was the little bit that he didn't agree with. But I'm going to come out with a little bit that I don't agree with Jan. This is the kind of a long road, 60 years. In one sense, you can't argue with that. You know, as to build a new culture, it doesn't happen overnight. But I think that much more could have happened overnight in terms of creating a new context in which people function. That is, creating some kind of socialist or radical democratic thing in the outset, even though it would have been plagued by all kinds of inheritances from a repressive culture that didn't let things flower. Nonetheless, I think people could have learned faster had they been able to create their own revolution and had they had an ideology that was more sophisticated. And you can say, well, they couldn't have had an ideology that was more sophisticated, or more radical. I guess, obviously they couldn't because they didn't. But I think for the future, to think that you have to start out at zero. I don't believe that's true, but I think that a global left culture is part of what would help make that happen.
Let me try to respond to some of the questions. Some are interlinked. I did try to explain that the main opposition in Czechoslovakia, but it to a large extent applies also, for example, to Poland, which I knew quite well, and I helped to facilitate cooperation between the Polish Solidarność, Czech or Slovak Charter 77, and the Hungarian democratic opposition even before '89. These movements were strong because they were united by what they opposed. Now, it is not true that there were no internal debates about what type of society they would like to live in once they would defeat the regime, and there were some among them who did believe that communism will collapse, although there were differences in estimate of when it will actually happen. But some people believe it will actually happen. And for example, the discussions inside Charter 77 were sometimes very, very sharp and very controversial, especially between what was vaguely termed the Charter left and the one who supported more, what I would today call more right-wing solutions. It is true that they genuinely believe that to make these disagreements public would weaken the opposition against the common enemy, against the repressive regime. But those debates immediately sprang to public knowledge at the beginning of 1990. And in fact, I remember during the first democratic elections, which took place in June 1990 during the campaign, for it, you already had a certain contradiction because the so-called Velvet Revolution was carried out by a civic group called the Civic Forum, which incorporated most of the chartists. But the Civic Forum, which had this sort of strange slogan that it's not a party, it's a movement, and that party is for politicians and Civic Forum is for the people. A nonsense which surprisingly many people believed. But the sooner we were getting towards the elections, some people correctly argued that the Civic Forum is a very strange beast indeed, because on the list of candidates for the parliament, you had a Thatcherite, Flipanite Václav Klaus on one hand, and a friend of mine, Petr Uhl, who at that time called himself a revolutionary Marxist, on the other, and they were running for the same party, or rather the same movement. They used to call it a party. And it was inevitable that this was short-lived. By the end of, by 1991, the Civic Forum collapsed, disintegrated, and a normal political parties emerged out of it, both on the right, as the Civic Democratic Party led by Klaus. On the left, it was much more difficult. Again, I tried to explain for psychological reasons. Many people with the collapse of communism rejected everything which was associated with the left. Therefore, even the word socialism was hijacked by the Stalinists, and therefore it was very difficult to campaign on it if you don't want to lose drastically. But it does not mean that there was no left, and that there were no people who actually put forward what I would call leftist ideology and leftist policies. But they were careful in the terminology they used, and in that sense, the social democratic terminology was much more acceptable, partly because it was not socialism, and partly because the Communist Party, during the previous 40 years, spent a lot of its time and energy attacking social democracy as its worst enemy, and therefore that was acceptable to people to embrace. And the new Social Democratic Party, which was created immediately after November '89, and which had very few members, by '98 was the largest party in the country and form a government. So I would not underestimate that, but bear in mind, as in democratic elections, you have to really respect the wishes of the people, and the majority of the people simply rejected anything to do with the left, which was encouraged by the media, which was run and staffed by very young and very right-wing people who took over the newspapers and became multimillionaires and very right-wing, and encouraged by the educational system. So in fact, there was no internal support for the left, and the Western left was absolutely silent. We've never heard of anything from anyone during the first few years when we faced the worst crisis. They began to contact us when I was in government, but not when I was attacked as a Secret Service agent by the right. While there was no violence with the breakup of Czechoslovakia, the situation in Czechoslovakia was very different from Yugoslavia or some other countries. There was no real animosity between the Czechs and the Slovaks. There was 72 years of life in one country, where there were certain differences. Slovaks felt slightly exploited and run by Prague, etc. So a number of them wanted more independence, but I would think more autonomy, not secession. Unlike what is believed even today in the West, and that's a great achievement of Václav Klaus. He fooled the whole of the West, including the United States. where people believe that the breakup was caused by Slovakia who wanted to secede, because there were Slovak nationalists who did ask for independence. Those Slovak nationalists were in minority, and if there would be a referendum which the constitution actually demanded, they would have lost. It was Václav Klaus, the Czech prime minister at the time, who wanted to dump them because he correctly argued they are poorer and they would slow our race to capitalism. And they are more nationalists, some of them are even socialists, they're very close to Russia. I mean, get rid of them. But he also argued the West will not understand if we say that. So we have to persuade the West that we want to keep the country together, and these nasty Slovaks want to secede. And Mečiar, the Prime Minister of Slovakia at the time, said, I don't want complete independence. I want confederation, which Klaus said, out of the question. You want us to be the insurance company for you, we'll pay your debt and you will do what you want. No, out of the question. You have only one choice. You either maintain the status quo, which he knew the Slovaks would not be prepared to accept, or complete independence. This Swiss idea of confederation. So he forced the Slovaks to secede. And what was interesting, I was there, our smooth transition was facilitated by the fact that Klaus knew what would happen, correctly estimated the Slovak response, and for example created Czech currency 6 months earlier, long time before he told the West there's going to be a breakup. So we had a very easy transition because everything was prepared. The Slovaks had much problems because they did not believe that they would become independent, and they didn't want to become independent. Secondly, the economy was so intertwined. You had so many mixed marriages, common culture. There was absolutely no reason for any groups, Czechs or Slovaks, to fight each other. I was member of the federal parliament then. I can tell you, we demanded referendum, and we knew perfectly well, in both countries, Czech and Slovakia, those of us who were against the breakup would have won, which is the reason why Klaus and Mečiar, Klaus in particular, agreed there would be no referendum, constitutional or constitutional. So very, very different from the Balkans and the animosity between Croats and Serbs and others. Why did join the European Union? That's a very controversial question. And I will give you my subjective answer, but I prefix it by knowing that 3 years ago I was in majority, now in minority. And in 3 years' time I'll be in majority again. I have certain problems with the figures which were given here by our Italian colleague. I don't defend the Czechoslovak government, I'm in opposition. However, it is true that current Czech Republic is the 6th least indebted country in Europe. The current regime, current government argues we don't want euro because we would finish like Italy. We don't want the Italian, Portuguese, Spanish debts. They are in real trouble. If we take euro, we will finish like Greece. They won the last elections by threatening people with Greece, saying if the socialists won, they would strengthen the social state, they would give away money to the poor people, and the country will go bankrupt like Greece. Now we were never anywhere close to bankruptcy, and we are still not even today, and I'm critical of the government's cuts. The argument is of the current government, those who have euro have problems. Don't join the eurozone if we want to remain prosperous. The argument against it is not that you can become prosperous by joining euro, because most of the euro countries have problems. The argument is, once you join the EU, you should show a certain amount of solidarity. To which Klaus says, solidarity with the EU is a terrible thing, because there is nothing worse invented by mankind than the eurozone. What he calls eco-terrorists and euro-optimists are worse than the communists. quote unquote. Now, that is not necessarily supported by others. But even the Social Democratic Party, which opposes it, says we should support the Greeks. We should support the Eurozone, although we are richer, and it will be giving away some of our money, which is the demagogy, because we do receive lots of money from the European Union. But if you look at Slovakia, one of the few countries, East European countries, which does have euro, although they are much poorer than the Czech, and are the poorest country of the Eurozone. Last year, a government collapsed in Slovakia because one of the coalition right-wing parties said, we poor Slovaks will not support the rich Greeks. And he compared Greek pensions with Slovak pensions, etc. Slightly demagogically, but it worked. And if they believe that on this nationalist wave of anti-solidarity, that they could win, tiny right-wing party. But they withdrew from the coalition, and therefore the government fell. And you had an election 10 days ago. For the first time since 1989, the result is a one-party government. Despite a proportional representation, despite a law which aims against one-party victory, Slovakia is today ruled by a Social Democratic Party which has a majority. That was a firm answer to the people about solidarity and the euro. The Social Democratic Slovak Party is strongly for euro, introduced when they were last time in government. So that's why I say in 3 years' time I'll be in majority again, even in my own country, because I believe history is on our side. Eurozone is facing major problems, but I do believe that integration is the answer. Not only economic, must be also political and social. So what we are aiming in is not a current capitalist bank-run Eurozone, but a Eurozone which will be based on social justice, on solidarity, on limitation of the financial oligarchy. Very difficult. But you can change that only from inside, not from outside. My comment.
We have to end in 5 minutes, but yeah.
Yeah, I think Antonio
Only
wanted
2
to
minutes.
just make one
Io
remark.
ho un'opinione diversa dal nostro collega ceco.
I have a slightly different opinion from Jan.
Parto dalla considerazione che in Europa ci sono 54 stati, molti di questi piccolissimi.
I started from the premise that there are 54 states in Europe. Some of them are very, very small.
Per esempio, i 10 paesi ex comunisti aderenti all'Unione Europea rappresentano il 21% della popolazione con 105 milioni di abitanti.
For example, the 10 ex-communist countries in Eastern Europe that I mentioned earlier, they represent 21% of the current population in Europe.
Ma soltanto il 7% del prodotto interno lordo.
But they represent only 7% of the gross income of Europe.
Ora no, ho un altro piccolo esempio. La penisola balcanica, la
Another
Jugoslavia,
example is the Balkan Peninsula.
oggi sono 7 stati,
That now consists of 7 states,
con una economia incapace ciascuno di essere autosufficiente.
with economies that are unable to be self-sufficient.
E allora noi crediamo, noi come organizzazioni dei lavoratori, come sindacati,
So as me, I as representing my union believe
che è vero che oggi c'è un'Europa delle banche e dei grandi gruppi economici,
that it's true that there is a European, a Europe of the banks.
ma ci può essere un'Europa dei popoli e dei lavoratori.
But there can be also a Europe of the people, of the workers.
Ad esempio la Croazia nel luglio del 2013 entrerà in Europa.
For example, the Croatia will enter Europe.
Non c'è disagio.
No, ma ho capito, però la domanda se la Croazia
No, he's answering to the question whether some countries should enter.
Se è utile o no, io dico sì, è utile che entri.
He believes that yes, it would be useful for countries, other countries to join
La comunità europea obbliga questi piccoli paesi almeno a rispettare alcune norme di interesse generale.
Because this would force some of these countries to respect some of the general norms.
L'orario di lavoro, la maternità,
maternity leave,
il lavoro
leaves, for
minorile,
example, unemployment, or employment for children.
So this is my opinion.
I'm just going to say something very quickly because we have to.
There is no disagreement.
Yeah,
No.
I noticed that 2 Europeans are agreeing.
Yeah.
It happens. There are leaflets over here with Campaign for Peace and Democracy's statement of purpose and our positions on different Libya and Iran and so forth. So please take them. We also have buttons if you'd like to get one for $1. This issue of New Politics, the one that I mentioned, only $1. And the current issue is downstairs at the New Politics table. That one, yeah, or you can get it for $5 from me. So you'll get one downstairs. Okay, well, thanks everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Yeah.